How would you feel when you are sitting with an old Japanese man who is serving you rice cakes with a smile on his face, all in happiness, and suddenly he starts creeping you out by telling you what it is like to cut open a 30-year-old man who is tied naked to the bed and dissect him alive, without anesthetic? Horrifying, isn't it? This could have been true if you had met this old man in 1995, when he gave the testimony of the Japanese Unit 731's cruel deeds in World War II. He was an assistant at that unit. But what was Unit 731? Unit 731 was a secret biological and chemical warfare research and development unit operating under the Japanese Imperial Army during World War II, mainly in China. From 1937 to 1945, which was the period of the Second Sino-Japanese War, which later became part of World War II, Japan's Unit 731, led by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, was involved in lethal human experimentation in that period. Shiro Ishii was himself a microbiologist, so this man was the main face behind Unit 731, which matched, or you can say surpassed, the cruelty of the human experiments done by the Nazis in World War II. The test subjects used for the experiments by Unit 731 were mainly Chinese and Russian civilians, including men, women, and children. Additionally, prisoners of war, including both Chinese and individuals from Allied countries, were subjected to the unit's brutal experiments. Let's get to the experiments. Bioweapon testing. Using biological weapons was largely restricted by international agreements such as the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which prohibited the use of chemical and bacteriological weapons in warfare. The Japanese Imperial Army's Unit 731 still used and tested them secretly. Japanese researchers performed the tests on prisoners with bubonic plague, cholera, smallpox, and other diseases. This research led them to the flea bombs used to spread bubonic plague. Bred in the labs of Unit 731 and its affiliated units, plague-infected fleas were used as biological agents to carry the disease. They infected fleas by allowing fleas to feed on animals or humans carrying the plague. Then those infected fleas were placed in containers or bombs. These containers were commonly named flea bombs. Flea bombs were then dropped from low-flying aircraft on the targeted areas, which were populated cities in China. As the bomb opened or dispersed, the infected fleas were released into the environment. Once released, the infected fleas would seek hosts to feed on, potentially transmitting the plague to humans. These types of bombs enabled Japanese soldiers to launch biological attacks, infecting agriculture, reservoirs, wells, and other areas with anthrax and plague carrier fleas, typhoid, cholera, or other deadly pathogens. During biological bomb experiments, researchers dressed in protective suits would examine the dying victims to study the effects of the epidemic. These experiments killed around 100 to 400,000 Chinese civilians. Chemical weapon testing. An unknown researcher described the experiment with mustard gas, which is also called Iperite gas. They did the experiment by dividing the prisoners into 3 groups and placing them in different combat emplacements, trenches, huts, and observatories. One group was clothed just with underwear, no mask, no hat, and was subjected to around 1,800 field gun rounds of Iperite gas around 25 times. The second group was clothed in military dress and shoes, 3 with masks and 3 without. Then they exposed them to 1,800 gun rounds of Iperite gas. The third was clothed in a summer military uniform, 3 with masks and 2 without masks, and they were subjected to as much as 4,800 gun rounds of Iperite gas. It damaged their skin, eyes, respiratory organs, and digestive organs. Then these groups were observed at 4 hours, 24 hours, and 2, 3, and 4 days after the shots. They didn't stop there. They kept experimenting with the groups in different ways. Frostbite Experiment. Hisato Yoshimura, also referred as the cold-blooded animal by the members of the unit, was the devil behind this experiment. In these experiments, which were guided by Hisato himself, the limbs of the prisoners were exposed to below freezing temperatures so the doctors could examine the effects of the frostbite at different levels of temperature. Sometimes they tied prisoners outside in severe cold temperatures, allowing the limbs of the prisoners to get frostbitten naturally. After long-term exposure to the extreme cold, guards would confirm the frostbite by hitting the body parts of the prisoner with wood. If the wood-on-wood sound was heard, the prisoner was said to be ready for the next stage. Then the doctors start using their different methods to treat the frostbite. It involved applying boiling water to the affected area, exposing that area directly to the fire. Few were left, as it was just to observe whether their bodies healed the frostbite naturally or not, which often resulted in the death of the prisoner. The bizarre fact is that Hisato Yoshimura never felt guilty about these experiments, which makes him a cold-hearted devil. Standard weapon testing. In weapon testing, humans were used to test grenades positioned at various distances. Some victims were tied to stakes. Then they were exposed to direct shrapnel bomb blasts. Sometimes they exposed them to a flamethrower from a close distance and from a long distance. All of this is just to understand the degree of the injury so they can treat the Japanese soldiers accordingly. In short, to practice the treatment of the injury so they could determine the perfect treatment. Vivisection. A former member of Unit 731 said in an interview that they vivisected not only men, women, and children, but also pregnant women, without anesthesia. They did this after infecting the prisoners to study the effects of the disease on the body organs. The old man at the start of the video was talking about these experiments. Some prisoners' limbs were amputated in order to study the effect of blood loss. Removed limbs are sometimes reattached to the other side of the prisoners' bodies. Some prisoners had their stomachs surgically removed and their esophagus reattached to their intestines. Removing parts such as the brain, lungs, and liver was part of their routine. Syphilis. It is a sexually transmitted infection. In Unit 731, they used to force syphilis-infected prisoners to have sex with non-infected prisoners. Then they were vivisected at different levels of the infection to observe the progression of the disease. Sometimes female prisoners were forced to become pregnant so they could use them in the experiments. Anyone who resisted was shot. Sometimes these experiments were done only for the curiosity of the doctors, like, what would happen if I do this? Okay, let's see what happens. Pathetic. The horrifying fact is that these aren't the only experiments they did at the unit. They also did experiments, like keeping the prisoners without any water or food to observe the time until death. Some were placed into the pressure chambers until their eyes popped out of their sockets. Subjects were hung upside down until death, crushed with heavy objects, dehydrated with hot fans, placed into centrifuges and spun until death, injected with animal blood, exposed to the lethal dose of X-rays, and the list goes on and on. In the name of war, science, and research, they did the torture, just to have an upper hand in the battle. You may think that they must have been punished for their deeds done in Unit 731. But no, the research was kept secret after the end of the war because the United States Army granted immunity from war crimes prosecution to the doctors in exchange for their data. After hearing all of this, we can say that this is one of the darkest chapters in human history, or I can say the darkest unit. That's it for today's video. Goodbye, sayonara.